Whether you're a veteran to the fringe subjects or totally new and curious, this video may blow your mind because I'm going to be giving you the most recent information from Tom DeLonge's newest book, Sekret Machines, A Fire Within. And importantly, I'm going to be sharing with you this grand picture that's emerging by comparing it to other insiders that have been coming forward in the last couple of years. Hey universe, Earth family, this is Joseph with the Cosmic Embassy, and you might as well smash that subscribe button right now while you're thinking about it, because in this video I'm going to blow your mind. I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to know about Tom DeLonge's most recent book, Sekret Machines, A Fire Within. I'm doing this again because when I compare the information from Tom DeLonge to all these other well-respected insiders like Corey Goode, Pete Peterson, William Tompkins, etc., it starts to paint this really vivid picture of what's been going on in Sekret over the last 70 years. And this grand picture emerges, and I really want to share this clarity with you. As an aside, I do highly recommend watching my first video where I covered Tom DeLonge's recent work, his organization, and his last book. But if you came just for his newest book, Sekret Machines, A Fire Within, you've come to the right place, because as of the time of this recording, there's nothing else like this on the internet. Alright, so let's jump into the information. So the book starts off with a bang, literally in ancient Iraq, and two young boys see something falling out of the sky. Boy number one's like, I'm going home. Boy number two's like, I'm gonna go investigate that. The next day, boy number one goes to look for his friend and finds him in the impact crater of whatever had fallen. I'm gonna read this from the book. Amar, he said, cautiously and watchful, what is this? Amar considered him and smiled. It is everything, he said. His face was full of something holy and exalted, as if he had indeed met the goddess and heard her truth. Not just lists, it's all the things on the earth and the heavens made usable, beautiful. It is people and trade and resources. It is story and worship. It is the end of error, of miscommunication. It is the prelude of the avoidance of war. It is the stuff of peace, of love, of all things. The other boy shook his head, baffled, looking at the strange carved lines and symbols, many of them repeating, sometimes variations. They spread out around the boy like a carpet, hours of meticulous, bewildering work. I don't understand. What is it? Amar smiled, this time his usual ordinary boy smile. Words, he said, not pictures, not sounds. How can you draw a sound, he said. Like this, Amar said simply. This, he said, is a gift from the goddess. It is writing. It will change the world and everyone in it. So if you're paying attention to the last video or you read the last book, you'll know that this tablet is something that the Nazis actually end up finding thousands of years later. And the thing that's obviously very fascinating about this is that they're essentially alluding to the fact that language itself was seeded by extraterrestrials. This takes place in an ancient Iraq that predates the language itself. And so they're saying the very first language that came to the planet was from something that fell from the sky and was a gift from the goddess. So that'll make more sense as we go forward. The last book literally ended with the main character being brought into a secret underground facility where a high-ranking CIA person essentially tells him that the Greek gods were real. And I'm gonna read a little excerpt from the last book to qualify all this. The character says, what does this have to do with religion? And the CIA guy says, absolutely everything. And he taps on a book of the Odyssey by Homer, though perhaps myth is a better term than religion, less loaded. Do you ever wonder how the Apollo space program got its name? Alan blinked. Apollo was the god of the sun, right? He said, and crossed the sky daily in a glittering chariot. The CIA guy agreed. So, let's consider the possibility that the chariot was more than metaphorical. Let me get this straight, said Alan. You're saying that the craft we're flying were brought here by aliens, which humans took to be gods of ancient Greece, but they left and now we have their stuff. And the CIA guy smiles and basically says, what makes you think they ever left? So the last book literally ends with a CIA guy telling the main character that the Greek gods were real, they were extraterrestrials, we have their technology, and they never left. And now the beginning of the next book is saying basically that all language was seeded onto the planet through extraterrestrials. This is totally mind-blowing. Let's keep going. And this might sound familiar to some veteran researchers. So the next part of the story is a farmer in Iowa who disappears, and at the same time all of his cattle are mutilated and killed, in impossible ways for humans to accomplish.
I guess one of the strangest things is the laser cuts. Why is there no blood? How come body parts aren't strung around?
In 50 years of farming, Tom has never seen anything like this. It would be highly unusual for a predator to consume gallons of the animal's blood, but leave the carcass intact. Strangely, farmers all over the world are reporting similar mutilations.
Now the police are perplexed, and Men in Black type characters arrive and get involved and begin to cover it up. And the actual phrase Men in Black or a man in black is used an absurd amount of times in this book, and it seems quite obvious that they're making a very intense reference towards the fact that Men in Black are real. And I've talked about this before, and I'm making a Men in Black video.
All right, kid, here's the deal. At any given time, there are around 1,500 aliens on the planet. Most of them right here in Manhattan. And most of them are decent enough. They're just trying to make a living.
Cab drivers?
Not as many as you'd think. Humans, for the most part, don't have a clue. They don't want one or need one either. They're happy. They think they have a good bead on things.
Well, why the big secret? People are smart. They can handle it.
1,500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was the center of the universe. 500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was flat. And 15 minutes ago, you knew that people were alone on this planet. Imagine what you'll know tomorrow.
There is a common thread in almost all insider testimonies on the subject of UFO and anti-gravity technology and extraterrestrials, and it's that there really are Men in Black types that come in and cover things up.
This is called a neuralizer. It's a gift from some friends from out of town. This red eye here will isolate the electronic impulses in your brains, and more specifically the ones for memory. Oh, that's good, fellas. Give me a splay burn around the perimeter with holes at 40, 60, and 80 meters from right here. Thank you. That's good. Thank you.
What in the hell is going on?
Excellent question. And the answer you're looking for lies right here.
I am just a figment of your imagination.
There's also many mentions of the book of covering things up in general. Here's another quote, and the Men in Black guy is basically telling the cop his case is closed and don't worry about it, the state's gonna handle it from here. And the cop says, this is a massive overreach by the state government. You can't sweep away evidence of whatever this is just because it might make people poke into things you don't want them to know. Actually, said the man in black, we can. And believe me when I say it's for your own good. Now, one of the cops is going further with the Men in Black, saying, you know, I'm going to take it to the papers, I'm going to tell the public. And the Men in Black guy's like, go ahead and try, basically. He says they don't want to hear it. No one does. They think they do, but deep down, they aren't ready. They wouldn't believe you anyway. Even if they did, you'd just be another Fruit Loop pointing at the sky. This country can't tell the truth from fiction anymore. You know that. Now, the next part is fascinating. This Men in Black guy actually takes one of the cops to this crop circle in America. And they even have a distinction between real crop circles and fake crop circles. They go to a fake one, they say, oh, look, the stalks are broken, etc., etc., etc. And then the Men in Black guy actually takes this cop to a real crop circle in America. And I thought this was really fascinating because before I started reading this book, I was thinking a lot about how if crop circles are real, and I know they are, at least some of them, that there has to be crop circles in the United States. And then I started reading this book and I was like, of course they're disclosing that in Tom DeLonge's book that crop circles are real and that they're in the United States. Here's another quote. Etched in the crop was a complex pattern of interlocking wheels and cog-like dials of various sizes, vast and ornate. It was intricate, elegant, breathtaking. Is that, the cop said. The Men in Black guy responds, one of 4 that appeared on the same night last week. We can go down and look at the field up close, but I'll tell you now what we're going to find. No evidence of physical violence done to the wheat, such as we might see if it had been executed by people with boards or vehicles. These stalks are bent at the midsection, not at the ground level. We'll detect lingering signs of microwave radiation and unusual magnetic fields. The plants will show new growth nodes, apparently formed very fast, altering the growth habit of the plant as it incorporated the larger design. Some of the stalks are even braided together. Again, not manually or mechanically, which would leave signs of stress or breakage, but evenly and organically. The weed isn't dead or damaged, but thriving, albeit in an entirely novel and apparently unnatural development configuration. All signs point to a phenomena that has simultaneously altered the core structures of the plant. The crop has been guided and fueled, but it has, in a real term, grown patterns of the circle itself.
Out of all of the evidence for the existence of UFOs, one extraordinary phenomenon continues to astonish and inspire me. The appearance throughout the world of so-called crop circles. These elaborate designs appear mysteriously swirled into crops of grain in such a way that the stalks are bent over, yet remain alive. More than 5,000 of these patterns have appeared in over 30 countries, most of them in England. The media has led many people, including me at first, to write these crop patterns off as hoaxes, the nighttime work of a few pranksters. Of course, there have been faked versions, but those made by human hands are crude compared to the vast majority of these elegant creations. Could hoaxers have created all 5,000 of these patterns? Could a few people with ropes and boards have created something as complex and beautiful as this one, made in the dead of night in a driving rain and leaving no footprints in the soil? The electromagnetic field over the area where the crop's been laid down to create the image is often electrostatically charged. Some of these areas are littered with strange magnetic particles.
So there's this really amazing exchange between the Men in Black guy and the cop who he's showing the American crop circle to. And he's basically asking him, what do you feel is the difference between this cattle mutilation scene and everything was chaotic and people are going crazy and stressed out, and then this crop circle, and it's so serene, the energy's so good. Like, what do you feel is the difference? Like, do you think those came from the same people? And I'm gonna read this quote. What are you saying, said the cop, that the cattle mutilation and the crop circle are coming from similar but different sources with different agendas? And he responds, different agendas, different plans, a wholly different sense of who we are and what we are worth. His eyes intense, his voice low. We don't know for sure, but that's what we think, yes. And until we know where we stand with them, both of them, whatever they are and whatever they come from, wherever they come from, we need to be very careful what we say. Now, I'll drive you to the nearest bus station now, and I'll put you in a hotel for the night if you prefer, but then you'll go home, you'll enjoy your retirement, and you'll say nothing. Because I think you understand that talking will only accelerate whatever is coming, and we, as a people, maybe as a planet, need to be ready. And this is really interesting because it points to kind of the mentality that they have in some of these secret projects about keeping the secret, don't tell the public, or we're not ready yet, or that's just propaganda. It's kind of hard to tell. I would say probably some people in the programs really think that, and then higher up they're seeding that kind of mentality as propaganda to keep the system as it is. And kind of at the end of this little segment here with the crop circles, he admits that they have super advanced teams constantly working on decoding these crop circles, which is really interesting because it just kind of blows the lid on the fact that there are American crop circles. We even have specialized teams that are constantly analyzing them. All right, so moving on to the next part. The book lays this really strong foundation that there have been mass sightings all around the world and even all throughout time. In the last book, they talk about how there's mass sightings in Japan and different places. And in this, the newest book, they talk in great detail about these different accounts of different places and different times. Even mass sightings, for example, in England that happened a couple hundred years ago and then happens again more in recent times. Same extraterrestrials, presumably, same place, but just a wildly different time, like more modern times. So clearly the military-industrial complex that's supporting Tom wants to lay the framework that mass sightings all over the world for a long period of time have been going on and not just recent. All right, so the next little segment of the book, super interesting. It's an account of the newly minted CIA before the CIA was called the National Intelligence Authority. And this member of the CIA goes down to Argentina in search of a Nazi. He finds him, and the Nazi's kind of hiding out. He's got a different name, different job, etc. But anyway, he waits in his hotel room. And an interesting point I throw in that's going to make more sense as we go forward is they actually reference the German as very lizard-like, which I thought is interesting, just because we've heard from William Tompkins and other insiders that the Germans actually were working with extraterrestrial reptiles.
A tremendously complicated agreement between the SS and the Draco reptilian group who were assisting Germany.
And so it kind of seems like that, and some of the other suggestions in the book through the way he wrote it suggest that they know that the Nazis were working with reptilians, and they're kind of getting people ready for it, even in Tom DeLonge's book. So I'm going to read you this quote, and it's this newly minted CIA member in Argentina. He's waiting for this German guy to come back to his hotel room, and when he gets there, he basically pulls out a black and white photo of Roswell and says, "Is this yours?" So I'm going to read you this quote. He reached into the briefcase and drew out a single 8x10 glossy black and white photograph. He pushed it across the desk face up and watched Mueller's face. "One of yours?" the CIA guy asked. "I mean, when I say yours, I mean, well, you know." The picture showed a ragged disc-shaped object about the size of one of the automobiles Mueller claimed to build. Its final form had to be guessed at because so much of the craft was stripped away, and most of what remained was twisted wreckage. It looked like it had been photographed under bright lights on a concrete floor of what might have been a warehouse or hangar. It was stamped top secret, dated 4 months earlier, and labeled simply Roswell, New Mexico. We don't really hear that often. We've heard tons of stuff in the disclosure communities about Roswell being, this extraterrestrial, that extraterrestrial. We captured extraterrestrials, a bits of weather balloon. So we've heard so many different counterintelligence stories, and this seems to point that actually Roswell was directly connected to the Nazis, which is really interesting. This is an account from 4 months after Roswell occurred, and they chase down a Nazi and say, "Is this yours?" So I'm going to give you another quote. The German guy is watchful as a lizard, another reptile reference. "You didn't just bring technical expertise with you to Argentina, did you?" said Scotland. "You people with your automobiles, Nazis." And he's saying, "I'm not a Nazi." "Yeah, no doubt. But the people you work for were and are, so let's not split hairs. My point is, our eggheads have been going over this little craft, its remote control systems, its means of propulsion, its flight characteristics, and they think that for all your skill and missiles and jets and shit, that you had help." The German's eyes widened, he was terrified, blah, blah, blah. So he's saying that the Nazis had help from extraterrestrials, and there's no way they would have gotten that advanced that quick, so they must have had help. And then he goes on to say, "I'm not going to say who that help came from. That's beyond my pay grade, and yours too, I suspect. But I will say this, you aren't the only ones getting help, and I think you'll find that our respective helpers don't like each other very much." And so this alone is just so fascinating. He's saying that the Nazis had extraterrestrial help that helped them get anti-gravity craft. The Nazis were probably the reason for the Roswell crash. And he's saying that the US military-industrial complex also had help from extraterrestrials, different extraterrestrials that did not like the extraterrestrials that were helping the Nazis. This is fascinating. All right, so the next part is a little gruesome. I'm going to paraphrase it, but I think it's really important, and it took me a while to kind of understand what this meant, so I'm going to explain to you. Basically, he had a rat problem. His uncle, who was a farmer, had a rat problem, and he bought a bunch of terriers to hunt down the rats. Now, the terriers were super efficient. They killed tons and tons of rats, but when the terriers were done killing the rats, his uncle killed all the terriers. Like, no nonsense, pop, just like he had done with the rats. Well, I was just a kid. I cried, begged him not to kill him, but he had. He said, "Work's done. Don't need him no more." And that was that. I ran away while he did it, but he never apologized, never explained. To him, you see, the terriers were just tools, like the spade. He brought them in to get rid of the rats. Once the rats were gone, he had no use for them. And the German guy's like, why are you telling me this story? You think I'm a rat? And the CIA guy says, no. And then he continues, you had help. The CIA guy says, but you only got that help because Uncle Jimmy wanted to put the terriers to the throats of the rats. So what he's basically saying is that the Nazis got help from extraterrestrials, but the extraterrestrials were really just using the Nazis as tools. And the moment they become not useful, they would just kill them as well. And it's a gruesome illustration, but it's really powerful and to the point. And it also demonstrates the mentality of some of these military-industrial complex people that, you know, how can we trust these extraterrestrials? They're just using us as tools. And some of that is really true. Some of them, like reptoid, or rather, I prefer to say predatory type extraterrestrials, they would see humanity as a tool. And we've heard this exact thing from different insiders. Like William Tompkins talks about how the reptilians were using the Nazis as a proxy for battles they were doing with other extraterrestrials, including this Nordic type extraterrestrials that were helping the US Navy. Corey Goode, we hear even in greater detail that the Nazis were being used by reptilian extraterrestrials to create a proxy type group to help them fight their wars out in the universe, including taking over other planets. And supposedly there's been a group called the Dark Fleet that actually has done this, meaning they have allied themselves fully with the extraterrestrials, and they have actually gone out of our planet. Humans from Earth have come into alliance with these negative extraterrestrials and have actually gone out into the universe and helped these negative extraterrestrials conquer other planets, other worlds, other people.
They're an offensive force. They're for going and doing offensive type of work alongside the Draco. They go outside the solar system on, I guess, conquest or defending Draco territory, helping the Draco on military expeditions.
So this is really fascinating and kind of disturbing, but fits in perfectly what we've heard from other trusted insiders, and so I have to throw that in there. All right, so the next part of this story, the American forces are testing a special type of nuclear bomb out in the South Pacific, and this particular type of nuclear bomb creates a massive EMP effect. EMP is electromagnetic pulse, and it's known to destroy electronics, interfere with communication, etc. Now, one of the scientists working on this knows that it's going to create EMPs, trying to warn everybody, and then they use it, and sure enough, it creates this massive, massive EMP blast. But one of the interesting things that happens is that when the bomb goes off, something starts to fall out of the sky, and they get a call from their superiors saying that something's falling, we're detecting it, you need to go chase it down. And there's this little interesting tidbit that I wanted to throw in here. One of the majors from Naval Space Surveillance Systems in Dahlgren, Virginia. This is naval space surveillance. We had well-established naval space surveillance systems all the way back in the 50s. And obviously they're very advanced naval space surveillance systems because they detected in an instant when this craft started to come down. So anyway, something falls out of the sky. They're told to go investigate it. They're out in the ocean on the South Pacific. They go to investigate it. The Chinese have also detected this crash and rush to retrieve it. The Americans arrive there first and are actually able to retrieve a piece of this craft. Now, the crazy part about this is that when they arrive there, this extraterrestrial craft, the cigar type craft, comes down from space and scans the whole area with this crazy bright light, and then like a million lasers shoot out in every direction and completely incinerate this craft that had crashed. So basically they launch this EMP, it actually knocks an extraterrestrial spaceship down into the ocean. Obviously they weren't expecting it to be that powerful, and then the extraterrestrial actually comes down to clean up and cover up its own mess, it would seem. And right after this happens, the Americans and the Chinese both basically give up and leave. So this is really interesting because it shows that the Americans and the Chinese were involved in intercepting extraterrestrial downed craft all the way back then. Also, there's reference to cover story that it was a nuclear satellite or something like that. This starts to bring up the whole concept of downed extraterrestrial craft, and I'm making a video about that right now with Emery Smith and others. We have created whole crash retrieval teams. And Emery Smith and Corey Good and others have actually talked about this in detail, meaning we actually shoot down craft all the time, multiple different types of extraterrestrials, a lot of them human-like. And when that happens, we immediately create a cover story. We send out a team there to try to retrieve the beings and the technology, etc. But I'm making a video about that, so we'll go into that later. But it's totally fascinating correlation from Tom DeLonge's book about ET crash retrieval. Next little tidbit of this part is that they say a transmission from deep space appears right after the nuclear bomb goes off, and the CIA guy is like, that's classified, don't pay attention to that. Quote from the book, the scientist says, I'm seeing a correlation here between the British Jordell Bank and the Goldstone Deep Space Communication Radio Telescope, which seems to show a transmission originating outside of our galaxy immediately after the Starfish Prime EMP. And the CIA guy says, that's not relevant. And the science guy stares at him like, what do you mean it's not relative? Do you hear what I just said? A transmission from deep space. The CIA guy says, yes, unblinking. We've known about that for years. Classified. Forget you ever saw it. So that just lays a framework for, yeah, we've known about this, we're just not telling you. Moving right along, the last little part of the ET crash is the scientist asks the CIA guy what he expects to find when they're going to retrieve the craft. The CIA guy says, I expect to find the past and the future. And I thought that was a great little quote because it just points to the fact that they know that our past originates from this extraterrestrial technology and beings, and that we're moving back towards it. The next part of the book is involving a Chinese airport in 2010. Basically, a cigar-shaped UFO appears over a Chinese commercial airport. It's not on their radars, it's not on any other instruments. There's a pilot coming in to land, and he calls the tower says, we don't see it, and the pilot's like, look out the window, you can see it with your actual eyes. The control tower sees it physically and then waits for an order. This is key. Tell the passenger there was a spill on the runway and we're closed for cleanup, safety precautions, over. And the pilot says, that's BS, they saw it, they know there's something in the sky. Negative, says air traffic control, say nothing till we've heard from higher up, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And then basically they say, we're done for the night, you're gonna have to go to another airport. We have some previously undisclosed military testing taking place in the area. Sorry for the convenience, forget about it. This just perfectly points out that the Chinese have known about the extraterrestrial presence and have been actively covering up as well. And also the fact that they create a cover story for the people and a separate cover story for the pilot is interesting. And right after this, at the end of this little segment, it reveals that the two pilots who are manning this plane are actually split up after this, sent to different airports on different assignments, and never hear from each other again. So these little tiny tidbits they're giving us in this section points to A, the Chinese are knowingly covering up the extraterrestrial presence and have been, and B, they have sophisticated ways of doing that. They've got cover stories ready to go. And the important part about this, beyond the fact that it's just fascinating that the Chinese have been involved with this, of course they have been. There's this famous speech from Reagan at the UN in the 1980s where he basically says that aren't aliens already amongst us, and I'll put that in here.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
And right around the time, what we've heard from insiders is that they actually created a secret United Nations to basically deal with the extraterrestrial presence, coordinate our efforts, and also keep this secret blanket all around the world. And this points to the fact that the Chinese also were knowingly keeping this stuff secret. And there's a couple other things in the book like that. All right, so the next important part of the book is Crete. Now, Crete becomes a central part of the second book. The crop circles that we talked about earlier when they decoded them, they actually point to Crete. And two of the main characters from the last book, the heiress and the debunker, get some information from that journal where they basically find out that there might be another one of these alien tablets in Crete. So they start their own private expedition to go and do some archaeology there and try to find one of these tablets. And this is very interesting because the Minoan culture and the history of the labyrinth and how it is all connected to the Greek gods. And like I said, the last book directly says the Greek gods were real, they're extraterrestrials, we have their technology, and they never left. Now, when they finally start finding stuff there in Crete, it's connected to the Nazis. And the Nazis had been, historically, we know that the Nazis had been there and all over the world doing archaeological digs, searching for esoteric information and technology. See, the Nazis were obsessed with finding secret esoteric knowledge and information, and according to some, they were very successful. Now, Crete is one part of that story that's very historically documented. In fact, during World War II, the Nazis went through great lengths to try to take back and hold Crete at various points, and they ended up losing many different airplanes and many different men trying to hold Crete. And just think about that. Crete is this tiny island in the middle of the Mediterranean, very far from Germany, and it has some strategic benefits, but there obviously is some other value that they put on it. Going a little deeper into Crete and Minoa, there is this double-headed axe which is called the labyrinth. And the labyrinth actually translates to the place of the double axe, or the servants of the double axe. And interestingly, in Crete, the axe was never used as a weapon, at least not in the beginning. It was always accompanied by a goddess. And when I was making this video, I got a really strong intuition to put in a piece of a video from Corey Goode and David Wilcock, Cosmic Disclosure, because I had this intuitive remembering that Corey talks about this double-headed axe technology. I'm going to put that in here.
As I was being pulled towards the door, I saw Mayans going in, and they had these weird things in their hands that looked like, kind of like an axe head, like a double-bladed axe head. But it wasn't sharp. It was just the shape of it. And they were holding them in their hands like this, kind of like a shield and a weapon, and they were holding it up and walking in, kind of hunched over. So it was obvious something different was going on. Once I was shoved through the door, I saw why. I looked, and peripherally I saw Mayans laying on the floor with those axe head looking instruments, weapons, kind of just bobbing up and down, floating.
So he's talking about the Mayans and how they have this tool that looks like a double-headed axe. And I wonder, could this double-headed axe actually be from ancient extraterrestrial technology that's turned into type of like cargo cult? The actual original purpose of the double-headed axe had been skewed, as many things had been turned into like a religious sacrificial object, blah blah blah. A couple other interesting things about Minoa and Crete is the idea of hybridization. So most of you have heard the story of the Minotaur, but basically there was a king called Minos, and he was in contact with Zeus, a Greek god, and Zeus basically became pissed at Minos and had his wife fall in love with this bull. And his wife went through this great weird lengths to create a baby with this bull, and it created the Minotaur. And that created this whole story of the Minotaur, and that created its own weird religions where people were sending things to be sacrificed to the labyrinth and the Minotaur. But anyway, I just bring this up to really lay in the historical framework for the fact that Crete has always been connected to the concept of gods and otherworldly beings, and Tom DeLonge's book points right back to that. There's an artifact that comes from Crete. It's these two bees on a golden necklace. And when I read about it in the book, I wanted to go investigate it in real life, and sure enough, it's an actual real thing. And it seems that they are suggesting in this book that even the bees, or wasps as we come to find, are directly connected to this whole concept of extraterrestrials interacting with an older version of humanity. I'm going to get more into the whole wasp concept here in a second. Now, the other part that's interesting is they directly say that one of these tablets is in Linear A. Linear A is a language that was never fully translated, that was found in Crete. Really fascinating stuff. Here's a little quote. So this archaeologist is looking at this tablet that he unearthed. It looked like a form of hieroglyphics, too simple to be pictograms, not enough recurring patterns to be writing in the conventional sense. Some of the logograms looked like a simpler Chinese character, while others looked runic. Linear A, he muttered. The scripted language of Minoan Crete dating back somewhere between 2500 and 1450 before Christ. Unlike Linear B, which showed up on Greek and mainland shortly after and was written script of the Mycenaean Bronze Age, Linear A, though it may have been one of the parent forms of the younger language, which in turn gave rise to classical Greek. This is really fascinating because remember the beginning of this book, this tablet actually came from the sky. It came from it was seeded supposedly by extraterrestrials. So for him to say that it's Linear A, which is the language where classical Greek came from, is basically him saying that classical Greek and most of Western civilization actually came, at least in part, from these extraterrestrials. Super, super fascinating. Now, while I was doing the research for this video, I looked into Linear A and tablets and stuff like this, and what I found is something called the Phaistos disc. And the Phaistos disc was found in 1908, and it was never fully translated, but the rough translation that just came through in the last couple years basically said that it was kind of a guide on how to live, how to form a culture, and that man should be doing agriculture, things like this. So I thought it was really interesting that there's this real life example of a Linear A tablet that seems to give humanity some instructions on how to live life. And in this book, it's basically saying that this disc came from the sky, it's in Linear A, and it's telling humanity about language and how to organize a civilization. So there's kind of a real world connection there. Alright, so now I'm going to bring you back into some of the discussion surrounding the pilot. Now, one of the most interesting parts of the pilot story in this one is they essentially put fake alien bodies in all of their unconventional craft in case it gets shot down to throw anyone off as to where the craft actually came from. I'm going to give you this quote. So this quote takes part in an SCIF that's been discussed by other insiders. It's basically a place where nobody could hear anything that's being said. And they show him a fake alien, and he thinks it's real at first. And what the hell is this, he breathed. Just want to put your mind at ease, said the CIA guy. We've been carrying them since the 40s. Useful bit of misdirection if we lose something we don't want people to know about. A rancher gets to it before we do, looks inside. Suddenly all he can remember, all he can talk about is little green, well, gray men from Mars. He barely takes any notice of the craft itself, and not very many people are going to take him seriously. So, really, really fascinating. They also go into great detail describing what it's like to fly these unconventional craft. So here's another quote. The pilot's in one of these spaceships, angling it up as he pushed the thrust lever, and the velocity scale leapt into life. As ever, the locust turned and climbed so effortlessly that it seemed that all normal laws of physics had been suspended. Alan felt no inertia, no g-force, no drag or strain as the great triangle knifed through the air. It was like being an angel, a god, and Alan remembered what Kenyon had said about the divinities of ancient Greece riding across the sky in their flaming, impossible chariots. What makes you think they left? So he's flying one of these craft and he's remembering how the CIA guy actually told him that the Greek gods never left. And he's kind of getting into a sense of what that feels like. Now, in the last book, the pilot got an opportunity to fly another craft that wasn't the Locust, the TR-3B. It was actually a captured craft, meaning probably from extraterrestrials, and it's fully consciousness controlled. So he doesn't even put his hands on things. When he wants to go left, he thinks left. When he wants to go right, he thinks right. When he wants to go faster, he thinks faster. When he wants to attack someone, he thinks attack. When he wants to evade, he thinks evade. I won't go into detail about that because we've heard a lot of that before. But one of the most interesting parts of this narrative line that I haven't actually heard before was that the craft was essentially destroyed in the last book, and they brought Alan, the pilot, in to interface with the craft to actually heal it. And this part's really fascinating, so I'm going to read you this quote. One moment he was aware he was in the room and everyone was watching him, and the next there was only the craft and his own mind blurring into his friends. The intensity of it, the intimacy was so startling that he almost let go, but his friend's grip was strong, and a moment later, Alan was barely aware where he was. He was in the ship. He was the ship. His former impression that the craft was an anesthetized patient came back to him, though he knew that the consciousness he was sensing was really his own and his friend's. Even so, he felt the disc like it was his own body, blood coursing, synapses firing, gas exchanging, bowels digesting, muscles responding, all the unnoticed functions of a resting body suddenly clear and conscious in his head. But somehow mediated by the ship, as if their minds had given it life and they felt what it felt. The craft was suddenly vibrant, interfacing through them, speaking its pain, its crippled dysfunction. For a moment, it was almost too much to bear. Alan grasped and sweated, close to sobbing with the electric agony of the thing. And then it receded and became somehow schematic, like he was inside a 3D blueprint. This was his friend's doing, he knew, but as he scanned the details, he could see quite clearly the gap between what was and what should be. With his mind, he reached out to one network of nerve-like connections that had been cut cleanly, and as he visualized them whole again, they reshaped themselves and made themselves complete. He felt it, a curious organic shift. It was, he thought, as if you could feel your own hair growing, the way your skin reformed over a wound. He felt atoms and molecules rearranging themselves at his behest as the disc reknit itself from within. It was a godlike feeling, but he felt only awe and humility. So this is super, super fascinating. We've heard from multiple insiders like Corey Good and others that there are these fully consciousness-controlled craft, and that some of these craft are actually alive and have their own consciousness. But up until this freaking book from Tom DeLonge, I have never ever heard of someone consciously interfacing with the craft and healing it at a molecular level. So great job, Tom. That's totally new to me. So the other important part to put in here is that the pilot starts to get all these telekinetic abilities, like I've alluded to before, through interacting with this craft. So by using this consciously controlled craft, he's actually gaining telekinetic abilities. And there's this really fascinating exchange between one of these Area 51 Dreamland scientists and the pilot, where she kind of discusses to the pilot their mentality in these secret projects. So I have to throw this quote in here. Metaphysics speaks to things that are essential to the lives of many people, questions of being and purpose, identity, religion, spirituality, and the pursuit of meaning. But such things are largely derided by the scientific community, not least because the proponents of metaphysics are often themselves hostile to science. Did God make the world is a metaphysical consideration, not a scientific one. And the insistence that God did make the world will generally be perceived as an anti-scientific premise, unless the nature of that making is so nuanced as to be rendered almost metaphorical. The pilot shifted in his seat. Okay, he said, but what does this have to do with me? She goes on, belief in psychokinesis, the ability of the mind to influence the physical world, is generally considered a debased form of metaphysics, a kind of mysticism which, in the absence of respectable religious tradition to back it up, is easily dismissed as pseudoscientific fantasy. But there are various brands of pre-scientific mysticism that put mind over matter, seeing the power of consciousness itself as a way to affect the world, faith healing, say, or levitation. The concept of energy fields connecting all things is ancient wisdom in matters of religion. Think of the notion of chi or ki in various East Asian cultures, the life force that binds things together and sustains them. You sound like Yoda, said the pilot. True, she said, and Star Wars certainly borrowed some ideas about the force from China, Japan, and other neighboring regions. But what if it isn't the stuff of space opera fantasy? What if we stopped viewing these ideas in the contemptuous terms of anti-science and the primitive? What if we were able to assimilate both positions as compatible within an expanded notion of physics and unified theory, if you like, which recognizes that the metaphysical concerns of the human mind, including its so-called paranormal capacities, can coexist harmoniously in a strictly scientific notion of the universe? Have you ever heard of zero-point energy, she asked. He shook his head. It's also called ground state energy. According to quantum mechanics, it's also all-pervasive energetic field that is random, ambient, and fluctuating. What's interesting about zero-point energy is that it exists even in so-called empty space. So instead of thinking of the universe as a collection of isolated particles, we have to view the universe as made up of continuous fields. The idea means that everything is connected not by matter but still by physics, all things and their absence being linked by energy. The question then becomes not whether such random fluctuations might influence matter, since they evidently do, but how we view such metaphysical concepts as thought and consciousness. The mind clearly functions in physical terms. If someone cuts one piece of your brain, your thinking is going to be affected. But what if the converse is also true? The activity of the mind can affect the physical, since the mind's activity must necessarily interact with the zero-point energy connecting all things. In quantum terms, the phenomena is more than plausible, and the truly scientific approach is not to dismiss it as pre-scientific magical wish fulfillment, but to seek proof of its activity and analyze how it functions. And the pilot says, I'm guessing we're not there yet. And this part's key. It depends on what you mean by we, she said with a twinkling in her eye. The scientific community as a whole, no. But one of the perks of doing research in secret is that your reputation doesn't depend on your being able to convince other people of what is clearly true. This is something wonderfully empirical about a place like this, Mr. Young. If something works, I don't have to know for certain why it works before we can use it. Think of the various flying machines you've piloted since you came to us. This is really, really fascinating because it's saying that in the secret projects, they have completely different understanding of science and metaphysics and telekinesis and how all these things that are fringe in the mainstream surface culture are actually totally studied and being utilized. And some of the things that they don't even understand are being utilized because they don't have to prove why it works for it to be useful. And we've heard this from Corey Goode and other insiders that in these secret projects and programs, they have a completely different understanding of physics and quantum mechanics and all the things they're using for a lot of these advanced technologies. If conventional scientists were to study them, they would be confused because it would seem to defy what they've been taught or what they know to be true. So it's really important to understand this as we go forward, to really start to grasp the fact that there are totally different models of science that are being applied on a day-to-day basis in secret. All right, so the next important subject in this book is genetic manipulation. So in the last book, the woman I call the debunker was taken during a fake alien abduction and her genetics were modified. And in this book, we learn that the heiress, one of the other characters, was taken when she was young and was also genetically modified. And the other two main characters, they were also genetically modified. And here's a little quote that points to that. She's saying, taking an infant and messing with the basic building blocks of her existence and adding what? Some grotesque insect trait, some leaning towards a hive mind that would link her to other similarly violated people. So this is really, really fascinating. It points to the fact that the dark government, the negative people who are aligned with the negative extraterrestrials are actually working together to modify certain people's DNA to make them more in the direction of these negative beings. Now, the two main characters, the pilot and his friend, are secretly modified when they're very young and their genetics are actually changed. And it seems to be through some government, corporate, military organization. And this correlates directly to what we've heard from Corey Goode and others, some of whom will be on this exact channel in the very near future, of what we call a MyLab, which is a military abduction of children for testing or to change their genetics, like it says in Tom DeLonge's book, or to train them for special purposes going forward. And the book actually strongly details that this was kind of a military corporate organization. Here's a quote. Part think tank, part R&D corporation emphasizing information technology with fingers in various military pies, including intelligence and engineering. They and related Leidos Corporation have contracts with NSA, Homeland Security, the works, billions of dollars. They recently absorbed Lockheed Martin's information systems and global solution business. Heavy stuff, seriously heavy stuff. According to stuff I'm reading now, SAIC adopted a matrix operating model in which different service lines collaborate to serve a given contract. What does that mean? It means one-stop shopping for the military and intelligence services. They do it all: physical tech, personnel, information systems, and intelligence gathering, connections all the way up the chain of command. You better hope these folks are on your side. And this points to a lot of different organizations. Like one of them is Serco, which is one of these contracting groups that is not actually American, that has become super powerful through tons of contracting and just having really integrated systems. They got their fingers in everything from telecommunications to research and development to aerospace to, the phone lines that around our country. So this is Tom DeLonge's book pointing to the fact that these organizations exist and that they're involved in abduction and experimentation of children. Now, this is huge. This directly corroborates what Corey Goode and others have been saying, that one of the most powerful organizations in our solar system right now is what he calls the ICC, which is the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate. And this is a group that is not actually governmental. It's a result of all these years of secret research and development in space, with all this advanced technology and extraterrestrials, and it's become the most powerful organization in our solar system, or at least it has been. And William Tompkin actually lays the framework for how all this came to be. In his book, he describes how, all these contracting organizations were getting all these secret contracts, billions of dollars, decades back. And just think logically for a second. If there's all these secret corporations that are getting all this secret money to work on all this secret stuff over tons of time, like we're talking decades, that creates this massive military industrial complex that is insanely powerful, with crazy technology that most of the surface population has not even heard of yet. Now, jumping back to the MyLab, when they finally apprehend the doctor who was doing the MyLab experimentation on these children, he basically says he'd confessed about the artificial modification of codons and amino acids in the human genetic code, tossed out the term scornfully about CRISPR and CS9, and then he used less opaque terms like targeted genome editing. And the Chinese were doing it, he said, as if that made everything okay, and that it was a huge leap forward, a monumental progression in the molecular biology with all manner of application, a field in which he had been an unsung pioneer. It really defines the mentality of some of these scientists and researchers in these secret projects, where they're doing things that are not necessarily ethical, but they think they're pioneers. They think it might have a huge help for humanity. So Tom DeLonge's book is pointing to that fact as well. All right, so we're almost done, and this is when it starts to get really weird. Now, going back to the heiress, who, to recap, she's the heiress of this massive wealth from basically an Illuminati type organization, a transnational secret organization that her father's part of. He dies, she gets all the money. Going back to her, she says one of the purposes of the Maynard Consortium, which is this international group, was to start and create a secret space agency. Now, here's a quote. What did he wanted, she asked herself, a rival space agency? Privately funded, independent of national interests, and outside the great Cold War pissing contest? That made it sound vaguely altruistic, but she had learned too much of Maynard's methods to believe that the organization's guiding principles had been benevolent. Power then, influence. They'd been building a force beyond the limits of normal technology for the purposes of their own. But what purpose? And why had her father gone along with such ruthless an organization? I think this is very revealing and fits in perfectly with what we've heard from other insiders. And it strongly suggests throughout the book that one of the main reasons this was set up was to assist negative ETs get a foothold here, which fits in with what Corey and William Tompkin says about these intergalactic rivalries between the kind of reptile, insectoid, or just negative predatory beings and the what I like to call the galactic feds, or the more order, light-oriented beings. Now, the book actually reveals that she was kidnapped when she was young as a way of extorting her powerful father into helping these negative humans and beings to create a foothold here and to develop these technologies on the Earth. And there's tons of references towards insectoid beings and her captors. She remembered it now. He had been carrying her. He had been whispering baby nonsense about elves, showing his infant daughter the woods he so loved. And they had been there, as they were now, pale and bright and beautiful, but not, she thought, what they seemed, whispering to him their promises and demands. Insect voices, the swarm that had thought as one, trying to make sense of the individual human and its solitary, fragile offspring. What power that gave them over him. And there's another part that says, the elven folk had always taken their changelings. Your father had to promise a great deal to get you back. And now we have this really interesting kind of real-life context coming from Tom DeLonge and his military-industrial complex sources that fairies and elves are real, but they're not at all what you think they are. In fact, one of the weirdest and most interesting parts of the whole book was the repeated references of elves and fairies, and not in a positive way. In fact, they're connected to these insectoid extraterrestrials, and it even describes how they disguise themselves to be beautiful. Here's another quote. She didn't know where the idea came from or why it had struck her now, and with such strange certainty, the word glamour seemed particularly right. In ordinary talk, it meant merely allure, the sophisticated appeal that some people radiated when they were suitably dressed, but the word went deeper. In the fairy stories of her childhood, it meant something like a spell, a magical veil that disguised the elves and goblins so that their true hardness and cruelty were lost in ethereal beauty. Fairies, or the fae as they were sometimes called, were cruel and selfish creatures, and it was only their glamour that stopped people from recognizing them for what they were. They were prone to random malice and delighted in spreading chaos and disorder amongst humans, and their acts caused pain, suffering, and even death. Acts such as abducting children. And it even goes on to say that they ride on these insects, like you imagine a fairy with these kind of insect wings, like Tinkerbell. But it goes on to say that in the old stories that the fairies rode on the top of insects, but the insects were actually a part of the fairies. She actually comes to realize that the fairies and the insects are not separate. Here's another quote. Except that the elves and their bugs weren't separate at all, were they? They were one. They had been painted separately because that's how people made sense of them, but the shining ones had always been somehow insects for all their magical glamour. Well, thanks a lot, Tom DeLonge. You completely freaking ruined my opinion of fairies and elves forever. So, near the end of the book, the heiress finally has a direct interaction with the positive extraterrestrials. Now, they come over in a spaceship, and she's initially kind of scared, and then they come down in seemingly the form of her father, who's dead. And we've heard this from other insiders that sometimes extraterrestrials will use familiar forms, people, or even an animal or something soft and cuddly to communicate with us because they don't want to scare us, at least the more positive ones. And so sometimes they'll take on a form that is more digestible to us, more palatable to us. And so in this book, this being comes down as her dead father and starts to communicate with her. And I'll give you this quote. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on you," said the being of light. "What do you want?" The answer came instantly and without thought. "To help my friends," she said. The creature seemed to consider this approvingly. "Once," it said, "we bestowed gifts upon your people, long ago, as you reckon it. They were for you, not for the others." "The swarm," the heiress said. Again, the pale creature seemed to think about this and inclined its almost human head in agreement. "If what you call the swarm were to acquire these objects," it said, "the consequences would be dire." "For you?" asked the heiress. She felt it smile as if she were a child who had been asked what 2 + 2 were, and she had answered with something not just wrong, but entirely inappropriate to the question. "Lemon, perhaps, or ambulance." "Dire," said the creature. "For you, your people, your world. You should prevent this from happening." "Can't you do it?" Meaning, can't you prevent it from happening? And the being of light says, "That is not my way, our way." I think it's actually really important how they put that in there because it seems to confirm how they said that's not my way, our way. It seems to confirm two things. One, it confirms this whole concept of non-interventionism by more evolved beings, which we've heard from tons of different insiders, which is basically the positive beings of the universe. The reason they don't just come down in their spaceship and save us from everything is because they're concerned with what we would basically call karma, meaning if they come down and positively affect the planet, it actually could be negative for them because they're taking away our free will ability to experience these negative things and to decide from them and grow from them. So he's saying it's not our way to intervene in that way. And it also alludes to the fact that the more positive beings, are actually more individual as opposed to the negative beings, which are repeatedly referred to as the hive mind. The hive mind, they think together. And so I think that's really important to put that in there. And next, they actually confirm that language was indeed given through the tablets, and it was meant to seed an evolutionary leap. Check out this quote. Long ago, long as humans reckoned it, it had been a gift to humanity. Language, writing, an exponential evolutionary leap forward in culture and technology. And though long forgotten, the tablets, for there were several of them, still had the power to stretch humankind, to tease and provoke the mind and make more potent, more suited to the next great evolutionary leap. Wow. This ties in directly with so many things we've heard, including David Wilcock talking about how there's these great evolutionary leaps throughout time, and that some of them are tuned and timed, kind of like seasons. There's these macro seasons. I'm making content and videos about that coming forward, so look forward to that. But it's basically the concept that there are these macro seasons, and there are certain things that can push us forward to prepare us more for those macro seasons. The most simple one would be love and becoming more spiritual, truly. But then there's also certain objects and technologies that can actually assist us in the direction of opening our energy systems and preparing ourselves for more energy flowing through both ourselves, our body, the planet, the universe, etc. I'll get more into that in future content. But honestly, I really wasn't expecting this from Tom's book, and I'm really surprised and pleased that they put this kind of information in his book. All right, so kind of wrapping up my review of the book here, there's countless references to lizards, reptiles, snakes, insect, swarm, hive. The negative beings are related to the swarm and a kind of hive mind, like I've said, and they were working with the Nazis and the Maynard Consortium, which remember is that international conspiratorial group. And like I said, this directly connects to William Tompkins and Corey Goode and what others have said. And the book actually makes this really interesting distinction between bees and wasps. And I think this is one of the last quotes I'm going to throw in here. The heiress and the debunker are talking on the phone, and the heiress says, I keep thinking about bees buzzing around me. I keep dreaming of them, golden bees. I keep seeing them. This image from Crete in particular. From Crete, she asked. An ancient Minoan necklace. 2 gold bees. You sure they were bees? I thought so. I suppose they could have been wasps. Like Yellow Jacket? I suppose. Does it make a difference? Does it make a difference? Said the debunker, now her old confident self. Let's see. Bees pollinate crops and flowers. They make honey. They live in symbiosis with mankind and literally sweeten our existence so that everyone starts freaking out the moment we suspect the bee population is in decline. I suppose so, said the heiress. Girl, we haven't even gotten started. Think about it. When a bee stings you, it loses a part of itself. Like it's cutting off a limb or something. It stings you, it's gonna die. Not so for a wasp, which, apart from making nothing more than more wasps, is the insect equivalent of the guy who cuts you for looking at his girlfriend. Wasps are not our friends. They do not come in peace. Have you ever heard people worrying about a decline in the wasp population? Can't say I have. And with good reason. Now think about it for a second. These things in your head and your dreams, are they bees or wasps? Jennifer thought. Her answer was entirely based on impressions she could neither defend nor explain, but when she spoke, it was of absolute certainty. Wasps, she said. Yeah, that's what I figured. What does it mean? She asked. Means we're in trouble. Kind of moving forward, she was trying to figure out what she could do about it because that girl was right. They weren't bees, benign and homely. They were wasps, and they meant her harm. No, she thought, with the same inexplicable certainty, they mean us all harm, meaning all of humanity. She paused to consider this, trying to unpack her own thoughts as if they had come to her from someone else and had laid them out where she could see them clearly. Yes, she decided, it wasn't just she who was under attack. The world itself and all of its people. We are at war and have been for years. And the enemy, not, and then she heard voices, but not English-speaking voices or any human language. They were altogether different brand of foreign. They chirped and scratched and buzzed, rising and falling in pitch and volume, throbbing wave-like pulses of sound. The whispered simply one word, swarm. So this is pretty freaking mind-blowing, because what Tom DeLonge's doing is they're actually going in great detail describing these negative extraterrestrials and how some of them operate in this hive mind, and even going so far as to making this distinction between bees and wasps, and how wasps are very aggressive and non-symbiotic. And I think it's a really apropos and important distinction they made here, and I'm really glad I'm bringing this public. So back to the whole concept of the swarm versus the cigar craft or the positive craft. The cigar craft was connected to the resonant crop circles, these beautiful patterns, the peaceful, loving, resonant snowflake energy, whereas the swarm was more connected to like the cattle mutilation and this aggressive kind of Maynard organization and the Nazis. And near the end of the book, the swarm type extraterrestrials actually come out and physically help the negative Maynard consortium trying to capture these tablets. And just in the nick of time, the cigar craft appears and counters the negative group. And the reason I bring this up is because we've heard this direct thing from real life trusted insiders, which is the positive beings are not going to interfere with our experience because they don't want the karma. But there's a couple caveats to that, and one of them is if the negative beings interfere on such a high degree that they're directly interfering with our free will in a way that we can't counter, then that kind of gives them some type of cosmic authorization to come in and intervene to counterbalance the negative side. And that's going to make more sense as we go forward into the future. And in the book, they actually call them these ancient enemies, or the ancient enemies of the swarm. It's just so interesting. And just to bring you back to the concept, there are distinctions between the individual consciousness, which is a more positive being, and the hive mind consciousness, which is the swarm. So I think it's important to throw that out there because we see this reflected in our culture. All right, so wrapping up this book, I have to throw in a couple of the negative things that I didn't like about the book. There is some definite programming. There's lots of there's references to alcohol, to coffee, quite a few references to racism. There's major brands, a lot of junk food, Wendy's, Burger King, Coke, Slim Jim, Jolly Ranchers, meat eating, Dunkin' Donuts. There's also Hallmark, BMW, Taylor Swift, Call of Duty, Xbox. I mean, the book actually ended with them drinking a beer. And I thought that was funny because it kind of felt like just like a subtle behavioral suggestion, like go back to sleep, go back to your normal life, to whoever was reading it. And all this points to major corporate ties and behavioral influencing efforts. None of this is random, putting in these major names, putting in these corporations, these foods. It's one of two things, and probably both. It's plugging the brands, and it's also, like I said, behavioral influencing. They want you to eat this junk food, and you have to ask, like, why? Why would they want me to eat this low vibe stuff? It's really interesting. Definitely are some elements of militaristic divide and conquer type stuff, and you could say that's part of the limited disclosure. You know, they want to tell us about extraterrestrials, but not all of them. They want to tell us about advanced technology, but not all of it. And they want to tell you that there is life in the universe, but be afraid, you know. But at least they did make the distinction that there are some really positive beings, but they never really even called them that positive. And honestly, I hate throwing this part in because 90% of the book I really, really love. But to be responsible and thorough, especially to those who won't read the book, I must put this in. There seems to be a direct psyop propaganda that confirms this is indeed a limited hangout disclosure type timeline that is being suggested. And in my opinion, this is kind of the smoking gun of the whole book. And when I read this, I almost cringed to death because I'm like, no, Tom, why? Why'd you have to do it, Tom? But anyway, so I'm just going to lay it out for you. So a psyop is a psychological operation meant to manufacture an opinion or steer a behavior. So let me read this quote for you and I'll kind of unpack it for you. So the former debunker is talking to the MyLab doctor and he's asking her, you know, who abducted her? And she's saying, I don't really know who abducted me. He says, like, what nationality were they? And she says, nationality? You think that matters? And he says, do I think the United States should pay attention to guarding sovereign soil from foreign incursions? And then she says, I think you have no idea what you're up against. But do you, he said. No, she admitted, not really, but I'm pretty sure they don't define themselves by lines on a map. Meaning, not all our enemies think of themselves as nation states. Ah, the doctor said, recovering his wry amusement. Listen to this. This is some leftist screed against global capitalism and the corporate power. I should have expected as much. Isn't it strange how selective you people are with your conspiracy theory busting? Is the government also dousing its population with chemtrails and operating child sex operations out of a basement of a DC pizza parlor? She responds, don't be absurd. But you expect me to believe in your tales of multinational conspiracy? False logic, Tamika shot back. Doubting one piece of received wisdom that everyone else accepts as true doesn't mean you doubt everything you're told. So don't lump me in with the crazies, man. I've come to believe in some things most people would think are nuts. Doesn't mean I think the earth is flat or that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. So you're a selective skeptic, he asks? Best kind. Oh, man. Why'd you have to do it, Tom? Did you read this? Did you know? You must have known. Why'd you have to do it, Tom? So much to unpack in this little segment. One of the counterintelligence tactics is to mix truth in with falsehood. So, you know, the first part about them not acknowledging nations and state lines, it's totally true. It's multinational conspiracy. He even throws the word multinational conspiracy in like it's totally crazy. He labels that as crazy and mixes it in with Pizzagate, and they both confirm that that's absurd. And so they're manufacturing consent from the reader. Like, if you don't agree with this crazy doctor and you do agree with Tamika, well, they both think Pizzagate is completely absurd. And then they go on to relate that to a flat earth and some conspiracy about China that I've never even heard. And so it seems very, very clearly that they're trying to discredit Pizzagate. What makes this super interesting and unfortunate is that Tom DeLonge has direct ties to John Podesta, who is at the center of the Pizzagate scandal because his emails were released through WikiLeaks, and that information is what kind of started the whole thing, because there was all this. I won't even go into it because there's so much information online, but it's really suspicious stuff. I'm not going to say it is or isn't real, but it's really, really, really suspicious. And to throw this in here, it doesn't even make sense with any of the book. And in fact, it seems like, to me, it's an obvious attempt to cover for John Podesta. And he also throws it in with actual psyops like Flat Earth, and some random one about the Chinese to delegitimize it further. And they both agree that this is ludicrous in the book, which steers the uninformed reader in that direction of thinking. This is very concerning and slightly saddening to me because I really like what Tom DeLonge is doing. I mean, I really support what they're doing in so many different ways, but why would they even put this in the book if they weren't trying to cover something up? It doesn't make any sense to me. I read this book 3 times back and forth when I was researching this video. It doesn't make any sense other than to be a psyop, in my personal, pretty well-informed opinion. I mean, pushing ET and anti-gravity disclosure, but covering up potential crimes that have occurred in secret and trying to steer the narrative in a particular way to maintain control will fail. And the history books of the near future will show who was on the side of the full truth. I truly know that. And like I said in my previous video, anything less than the full truth is a carrot on a stick, which leaves us open to being manipulated more by those who committed mass atrocities in secret. may they be human or non-human. So Tom or any other people in To the Stars Academy or his advisors, if you may be watching this, I really want you to know I support you and I want to help you with what you're doing. I want to help you shift the perspective on the Department of Defense and these projects. But I want to tell you, the macro spring is upon us. The lights are on, and those who thrived in the darkness are running and hiding and will continue to do so. Everything must adjust to our new planetary and solar environment. And I suggest further discernment in who you ally yourself with. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to discuss this further or clear this up. For the most part, I'm with you guys, and I want to stay as neutral as possible because I want to bridge the gap between all these different narratives and the military and the awakening communities, because we're all human on Earth, all understanding these crazy revelations about extraterrestrials, advanced technology, etc. It's time we come together in unity. Having said all that, this book was mostly positive and the message was powerfully good and groundbreaking. All right, so here's my 8 major takeaways from the book. 1, some crop circles are real and they're being studied by secret projects. 2, stunning admissions about mass sightings and extraterrestrials all around the world and all throughout time, some positive and some negative, and ongoing interactions with our government and military. 3, how all this connects to our ancient past and indeed the origins of civilization itself and even the language. 4, we've developed extremely advanced technologies in secret, and they all have their connection to the ancient past and the fact that our military has been connected to positive and negative extraterrestrials, and the Nazis were connected to negative extraterrestrials. 5, covert programs have a completely different way of looking at the world and science. They have their own models of physics and understanding how matter interacts with thought because they're not burdened by trying to have to convince everybody else. 6, covert genetic experimentation on humans, sometimes under the guise of fake extraterrestrial abductions and even military abductions. 7, massive, systematic, methodical cover-ups all around the world by multiple different governments. And finally, 8, super powerful multinational groups with infinite money that have their own space programs and are interacting with extraterrestrials. Wow, well, I don't know about you guys, but this information is completely mind-blowing. And I've been researching this information for years in great depth. And Tom DeLonge coming forward with all these super credentialed mainstream type people talking about aliens, anti-gravity, secret facilities, abductions, the Greek gods, and how our ancient history is connected with extraterrestrials. It's just bam! And the fact that this directly ties into what we're hearing from all these other insiders, it just totally corroborates what they're saying. And like I said in the beginning, it paints this really vivid picture of what's been going on, not only in the last 70 years, but in the entire history of humanity. We truly are in the cosmic brackish waters, if you know what I mean. The brackish waters are where the ocean water meets the fresh water and the unique life that grows there. Alright, so check out the other videos from the Cosmic Embassy as they come out. I'm also making shorter videos of everything for those who have a shorter attention span. I'll make like a 5, 10, 15-minute version of these. I'm calling those bite-sized disclosures, so check those out. I'm currently creating a video on Tom's other book he did with Peter Levenda. I'm also covering in great depth the work of David Wilcock, legendary aerospace designer William Tompkins, Corey Good, Pete Peterson, and others. And I'm also making disclosure music and parodies and disclosure ASMR videos, so look forward to that. And let me know if anybody wants to help with any of that. So make sure you hit that subscribe bell, it helps a lot. Continue on this journey with me. Thank you so much for watching. Please like this video and comment down below what you think about Tom DeLonge's newest work. Thank you.